Scott3 again. This will be lecture 3 of 10, and we're still looking at some of the themes of extremes in this Anecdote to Extreme Violent Movement lecture series. I want to highlight some of the things we talked about last time. In that, we were talking about really the fragile state and the fragility of the state structure and how it brings about services and various things to its population that it's supposed to be responsible for, or that the citizenry feels that they're supposed to be responsible for. This is kind of another feature. This is the other side of that equation, where in the fragile state, the government is not able to really offer the kind of service support and identity and confidence and trust building that is really required. So now we have the citizenry side of this, and what we'll often see are, and it doesn't necessarily mean majority gets support. Oftentimes we've seen various groups are ruled by minorities, as we saw in the case of Rwanda. We talked about that. In Iraq, prior to our invasion, the Sunni population under Saddam Hussein was, I believe, and don't quote me on this, but was about a quarter to 30% of that population. There were Kurds, and then there were Shia, and the Kurds were ethnically different, but also Sunni. But the Arab Sunnis aligned with Saddam Hussein, but they were definitely a minority, and they controlled things. I think similar, the Alawites in Syria, and we see this is not an uncommon theme. So what you have is maybe a minority that, but they disenfranchise or isolate or undermine other segments of the society, often as a means of gaining power and holding power, and they'll pit various groups off of one another. The product of that, you do have somewhat of basically creating more and more of a fragile state, but you also have a population that becomes isolated. They have very little stake in the existing government, and with that are really where the opportunities for extremism to really play an active role. So in our 5 countries, and always adding the 6th of Nigeria, we'll go just because of my background, but we'll look at those that the success that they had were not because they didn't have the same features that most others have, most other nations in this predicament. What they had was a similar fragile state situation. They also had a very strong segment of their population that felt isolated or without a stake in what's going on. So kind of laying that out just to show that, just because these things exist doesn't mean that it's predetermined towards the outcome or that it's inevitable. What is more case in point is, despite these situations being similar from country to country, certain elements were able to have a positive outcome, and certain steps were made that guided these countries past a total devolution into something that actually is very significant and beneficial to its citizenry. And in the cases of all of these countries, all of its citizenry has benefited. Truly, a rising tide floats all boats. Just from a comparative, though, we're looking at, as I've said previously, we have some countries coming out of a colonial architecture, and that certainly plays heavily into why some of these segments of the population were isolated. We've talked about Rwanda between the Hutu and the Tutsi, and that the Tutsi had been favored in the colonial era. The Hutu rise out of it. They are, I'm pretty sure they filled that minority status, but they were able to sway enough power to then massacre 800,000 Tutsis. I think a genocide as we said earlier, it's really an ethno-genocide. But that was something that would certainly remove a significant stake in the game for the Tutsi population. The Tutsi population was actually isolated so much that it became a diaspora, and they poured into other nations to escape the violence and the ongoing effects of what was going on there. Botswana, although being post-colonial and no genocide, still had a significant challenge in that their population, as said previously, Bucanaland was not even seen as a valuable state to the British colony. It was a buffer state against German aggression in Africa. The population wasn't really integrated in. They have a very different tribal structure that was allowed, because of its low importance, was allowed to really develop. But with its development, while it held a stake in its own game in the colonial structure, it had a very, very small position to play within that structure. So, and you have a very tribal, not cultured. They aren't integrated into British type. So at the time of their own independence and taking of their own sovereignty, there was very little that made it really possible or even predictable that they could take up the strain. They really didn't have any stake in the colonial side, and there was very little to think that they would have a stake in the post-colonial side, especially with all the bad influences around them coming out of Mozambique with Frelimo, Renamo, the apartheid South Africa in the South, etc. So many influences that really said poorly about what their future held, and that they didn't really have an integration into what the modern world was at the time of their independence around 1960. So you have, quite contrarily, you have a much more tribal type structure where discourse and consensus building very much antagonistic towards typical democratic politics, where where democracy sways, majority holds. They didn't have a structure like that. It was very deliberative. They would debate a lot, and then they would come. So it wasn't an efficient model. And so then, even within that, though, you have a large segment of the population in Botswana unsure of what its future is. All these ideological movements around them. There's a strong Marxist movement, and they're preying on that. And I do want to identify that this, both the state level of fragility and then this isolated population without a stake in the game, and most importantly, I should say this, a perceived stake in the game, are ripe for exploitation by extremist movements. In the case post-colonialism, where it had the Cold War, you remember we said that structure is very, very important to where these go. There is a Marxist influence that comes in, certainly in Botswana, and there is that playing against Khama and then how he tries to rebuild the nation. But you do have a growing segment of that population feeling isolated or without a stake, and its future is very unpredictable at that point. Similarly, we see in Singapore, the Malay population had isolated the ethnic Chinese population for a long time. Another exploitive situation with the Marxists. They're certainly taking their opportunity to say, hey, we can provide you, ethnic Chinese, an identity, a movement, kind of a fulcrum upon which you can launch your own initiative. You'll have full support back to mainland China. We can follow a Maoist movement here, and everything will come out just great. And so you've got a fragile system or structure as it's just developing at their new time of independence, and then you have these ideological movements that are preying on long-held aspects of isolation for the Chinese, specific against the Malay society, and they're actually putting in their leader to say, "Hey, integrate the Chinese back in with the Malay population." Lee Kuan Yew is not successful at that. Actually, his original driver was to integrate those two populations. He fails it. So now you have a truly isolated group, being the ethnic Chinese, on this Malayan peninsula or Malayan island, and you've got this problem of this population doesn't necessarily know that it has a stake in the long-term future of Singapore's direction. They're not aligned with the Malay. The Malaysians are much more powerful, seemingly, and we've got this element playing here as well. Peru. Definitely the Cold War factor plays in. You have a rural population. There have been numbers of dictatorships that have come through Peru, one after another, heavy-handed, isolating the rural populations. The farmers have a very different religious and cultural background than those in Lima. You have a group, they're isolated, and so the Shining Path, they definitely exploit that, obviously with a Maoist, Marxist ideology. They're preying on that, so you have a fragile state structure, dictatorship after dictatorship, heavy-handed politics, heavy-handed security elements. They've launched one military, army-led initiative after another to try and bring these outer areas under sway. Obviously, the heavy hand isolates people. People don't feel that their needs and interests are being represented back in the capital or under the existing governing structure. And even if it's people that come from their district, they're often swayed under their own pressure and politics of Lima, often as you would see with with courts of medieval Europe and and that era of the kings and queens of Europe and the royal structure. The courtesan politics even takes rural representation and becomes its own lifestyle, to the extreme of France with King Louis. But those things do start to play. So even when you send representatives into this structure, you don't feel that you're properly represented. Oman, similar. This is to a great extreme, very, very illiterate population. They're coming out of their own colonial type period, both under the Ottomans and then the British. And then you've got this movement to its south in Yemen, of a big communist movement. South Yemen has broken away. There's a big civil war there. That civil war goes on for quite some time. I've spent a good bit of time in Yemen, and the effects of those dichotomies still play to this day. Now they're just in a different form. It's not communist, but you do see the various. That place is completely fragmented. I was there prior, trying to help avoid that. But the aspects of Yemen are now bleeding over into Oman, and you have all of these groups of Arabs that feel that they have no identity with the capital of Muscat, and it's a pretty large ungoverned area. Traditionally, no one really held sway there. They don't feel that they're not necessarily feeling like they're not represented in Muscat. They don't want to have anything to do with Muscat or any power that's coming out of any place. They are a very independent people, a Bedouin society, and the government, whatever relationship they've had, has typically been antagonistic. And it gets even more antagonistic with Sultan Qaboos, his father, whom Qaboos overthrows, where they go to an extreme of saying medicine, spectacles, radio, everything is banned. So, you really want to hold great influence with people. Yeah, go ahead and toss some of those things out. I can't wear glasses. We shouldn't use medicine. And music on the radio is bad. That's going to chap about everybody in the mix at that point. So what you have in these five nations is an extremely antagonistic government often, or an antagonistic power that isolates and antagonizes a certain group of the population, often to try and structure their own power base at the expense of another. I found my own experience, and just relating personally with Nigeria, we work up in the north. If you know anything of Nigeria, Nigeria is really two different countries, and that's being very generous. Some people have said it's 2,000 different countries, but you have two different countries. You have the south, Abuja, Lagos, and then all the southern states. They are fairly prosperous. The oil is there, and everything functions there fairly well. The government has a heavy focus there. And there was a move to put the capital in Abuja to bring it more centrally, so that the north, where I operate, is more represented. Much like the United States chose to put Washington D.C. right on the Mason-Dixon line to give North and South some feeling of equal ownership in the capital. Geography sometimes matters. In Nigeria's state, there's a heavy Muslim influence up in the north, although I thought it would be much more uniform Muslim than I found it. Families are integrated, brothers and sisters, and brother on brother. You can have a Muslim brother and a Christian sister, and they intermarry, and it's a very, very, it's an interesting mosaic of people. But what you do find common among the northern Nigerian is the feeling that they are not represented well in the south. The movements of ISWAP and Boko Haram, there is no coincidence that happened under Goodluck Jonathan's reign. And Nigerian politics are that you have a period of time where Christians are able to be elected, then you have a period of time where a Muslim is able to be elected. The insurgency started during the Christian time with Goodluck Jonathan, but has persisted into the Muslim Buhari, who's there currently. And it's very interesting to watch. Even Muslims are critical of Buhari, and Christians are critical of Goodluck Jonathan, and they all share a similar thought that the government in the South does not represent their interests in the North. They're heavily agricultural in the North. They're very Muslim, Sufi, as I said. They feel very, very isolated from the powers that are made. And I bring in, as I said earlier, around Peru, you send representatives to the capital. The feeling in Nigeria is as soon as they leave their Adamawa State or Borno State or Yobe or one of the others, the plateau, they're gone. They are now part of Abuja society and the politics of Greater Nigeria. They are no longer a representative of the people whom elected them to that office. We're experiencing that now in Adamawa, and there was a lot of criticism of the current governor of Adamawa State, and not so much Borno, but that is coming on too. As soon as they went to Abuja, they seldom come back. They don't visit much, and when they do show up, it's 15 vehicles, and they're not accessible to anybody, etc. So it must be understood what the feeling of isolation, what that feeling the social contract has broken down between the government, be it a fragile state or being just a state that doesn't project power or project any influence into that region. In the case of Nigeria, it was heavily driven by oil. There was a lot more homogeneity about the area pre-oil. When oil came on, agriculture really got dumped, so the north got dumped. The Christians had really access in the south. The Muslims were in the north. We're keeping the wealth for us. They isolated and alienated the northerners who were heavily Muslim. And then we saw that kind of a fracture where a lot of policy and a lot of decisions were being made at the expense of the north. Good sized population there. They begin to look for alternative methods of having some influence or having some kind of something for them to come out of a government structure. Here shows up Boko Haram and ISWAP. I'll use those two right now. They are separate groups under separate leadership, but they emanated from the same. They started bringing in various things to benefit that local population, and they really focused on the opportunity of the isolation that existed between those in the north and their Muslim identity to those in the south and the Christians, and really blaming all parties, and so much so they even blamed the existing structure that many of the northern Nigerians were part of, being the pastoralist, the herders, and Sufi culture. A lot of the Sunni influence and Shia influenced insurgents and antagonists played on that, said, they haven't represented you well either, nor has the government out of Abuja. We can provide you something better. Come to Sunni Islam, allow Sharia law to exist, and everything will be improved. And, the truth is, things weren't great, and they brought a little bit of order that hadn't existed there. An order not in the case of like, oh, life can go on, and I can do commerce. No, they ordered certain things that were very annoying to a northern Nigerian's life. They brought in a judiciary via the Sharia courts, and they adjudicated cases. Not real exciting, not overly sexy, but extremely valuable to people. And that is how easy it can be for an insurgency to find root, is to find where a fragile state or a state that has chosen not to project service and power and influence in an area and representation and follow through on a social contract, how easy it is for those people to fall under the sway of a movement that comes in offering something of value, something of tangible value can be found there. So that is going to be the conclusion of lecture 3. So we are, really looking at, we're starting to understand fragility in the state and how that isolates people and why these people are so really ripe for an insurgency to come about. But we also understand that this is not the inevitable outcome. That is not the case as happened with the 5 countries we're looking at. And I hope someday to claim that the 6th that we'll look at would be Nigeria. We're not quite there yet. But anyway, look forward to seeing you on lecture 4, and have a great day.